Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This happens to be for our class for Thursday, the 10th of June, where we are finishing up with Frankenstein. I wanted to talk also a little bit about paper number 1 and get us ready for persuasion. And at the ending of today, 11:59 p.m. on Thursday the 10th, is when your first journal is due. Though certainly if you need a little bit of additional time, just let me know and I'll be happy to grant you an extension. In last class, we were talking a little bit about the structure of the novel itself, with Walton serving as our sole narrator and some of the problems that brings forth in terms of the reliability of the narration. But regardless of whether or not we can trust the narration, we definitely see that there are parallels between Walton and Victor. And at least in the edition that I'm using on page 17, we learn about Walton's monomania when he says that I preferred glory to every enticement that wealth placed in my path. And it's something that we will see that basically Victor does as well. And in the second letter, he talks about, I have no friend, Margaret. And we talked a little bit about how Victor continually isolates himself, and that's one of the reasons why he ends up in the situation that he does, and trying to basically defy nature and the consequences of that. And at the ending of letter 3, he says, what can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man? The idea is that many things should stop that, and that ultimately that arrogance and that hubris will be punished. And that's the cautionary element of this particular tale for us. I stopped with Walton and I didn't talk very much about the following chapters. And what we get is Victor's story, and eventually we get the creature story. And while, again, it's easy to forget, all of this is through Walton's interpretation. So chapter 1, Victor talks a little bit about his birth and his parents, and his statement about how I was their plaything and their idol, and something better, their child. For me, that's on page 33. I think says a great deal about Victor and also his perspective on parenting. There is something about the sense of possession that Victor has both for the creature and also for Elizabeth as well. It also strikes me as rather ironic that Victor had a very good childhood. He talks about how basically he was given love and attention, and then we know how that is not what he gives for his own creature. And also in chapter 1, Victor tells us a little bit about the introduction of Elizabeth, that this child was thin and very fair. Until death, she was to be mine only. Again, this sense of possession. And for me, on page 34, the ending of chapter 1, we learn that Elizabeth appeared to be of a different stock. The 4 other children were dark-eyed, hardy little vagrants, but this child was thin and very fair. Her hair was the brightest living gold, and despite the poverty of her clothing, seemed to be a crown of distinction on her head. And this is one of the reasons why Victor's parents consent to adopt her, this very stereotypical idea of beauty. And certainly the sense of appearance is important in this novel when the creature is rejected solely because of its appearance, not necessarily because of its behavior. And then in chapter 2, we learn about Victor's monomania, that he says, the world was to me a secret which I desired to divine. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired. And this is on page 36 in my version of chapter 2. And I talked a little bit last class about Dr. Faustus and about trying to achieve the knowledge of the gods and consequently being punished for that. And the novel prepares us with this sense of Prometheus as well, since Victor is indeed the modern Prometheus. And he talks about, my temper was sometimes violent and my passions vehement, but by some law and my temperature they were turned not towards childish pursuits, but to an eager desire to learn, and not to learn all things indiscriminately. And again, very similar to Dr. Faustus. And the consequence of this, as he continues on, and he talks about how he thought that his feelings of discontent and dissatisfaction were at least a explanation, if not a rationalization, for the behavior that he engages in when he tries to defy the laws of nature. We go on to chapter 4, and Victor says, I shunned my fellow creatures as if I had been guilty of a crime. And note how often he says this in the novel, where it was as if I was guilty. He is guilty, and he continually has difficulty accepting responsibility for his guilt. Even with Walton, because when we return to Walton and Victor's tale, at the very ending of the novel, Victor is still vacillating back and forth. So, in chapter 5 is where we finally get the creation scene, and this is what everybody has been waiting for, and this is what Hollywood has prepared us for, but we've got to wait for a good amount of time before we can actually get to this particular place. Prior to this, Victor talks about, I am not a madman. It's very Poe-like, if you know anything about Edgar Allan Poe, that each declaration of the narrator saying that the narrator is not mad merely proves madness. And then Victor also talks about that because the minuteness of the parts of his creation formed a great hindrance to his speed, he resolved, contrary to his first intention, to make the being of a gigantic stature, 8 feet in height and proportionally large. It's on page 52, or at the ending of, or towards the ending of chapter 4. This does explain the size of the creature, and also it does explain why the creature has the ability to persecute and pursue. And if we wanted to think of this novel as a commentary on parenthood, one of the reasons why, perhaps the reason why, parents are able to exert control and authority over their children is because they're bigger and stronger and more experienced. And we see how ultimately the creature turns that on its head. The creature cannot be controlled. Sometimes parents talk about as their children get older and become larger that they can no longer control their particular children. But of course, that creation scene in The Dreary Night of November, I had talked about how this novel is very much in the Gothic tradition, so setting is oh so important. So, and I'll read to you the first few paragraphs in chapter 5. For me, this is on page 56. It was a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes. My candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion. I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful? Great God. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing. His teeth of pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same color as the dull white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. And of course, this is very different than the Hollywood version we get of Frankenstein. In the 1990s, there was an adaptation of Frankenstein that was done with Robert De Niro and Kenneth Branagh. And while it does take some liberties, it doesn't take nearly as many liberties as the 1930s version. And we do get the appearance of a Frankenstein that's more like what Shelley envisioned for Frankenstein. So certainly this idea of the appearance of the creature and that being an alien appearance as compared to humanity is one of the morals or lessons within the text, that we tend to reject that which we aren't familiar with. And I always think of a Twilight Zone episode, actually. It's called Beauty is in the Eye of the Beholder. I'm not sure if any of you have ever seen it before or not. But Twilight Zone used some of the best short story writers of the day for their series. And the plot of this particular episode is that there's a woman who's undergoing plastic surgery to correct a deformity in her face. We don't see her face. She's wrapped up in bandages. And we don't see the doctors either. We just see her wrapped up, and we hear the doctor speaking to her. And eventually they unwrap the bandages, and she looks in the mirror, and she's horrified. But we as audience are quite confused because by any standard of our society, she's quite beautiful. And then the camera pans out and we get to see the doctors. And the doctors are what we in our society would call these deformed creatures. So obviously in this particular society, she being alien or different is considered to be deformed. So beauty is indeed in the eye of the beholder. And I always think of this text as a text that makes reference not only to the idea of standards of beauty, but how we oftentimes judge based on appearance, things that result in racism and sexism and classism and ageism as well. So I think it's a very contemporary text, even though, as I had mentioned last class, as progressive as Mary Shelley was, that doesn't necessarily mean that she wasn't influenced by her day. There's definitely a very Eurocentric element to this particular text, and there's very much a Christian element to this particular text as well. So after that very famous creation scene that we've been waiting for, we learn about a character named Justine. And she's introduced, in my opinion, in a rather awkward way. This is through letters. So much of this novel is through letters. This is Elizabeth, who is reminding Victor of a great favorite of his in the family, saying in chapter 6, Justine, you may remember, was a great favorite of yours. And this, for me, is on page 63. And of course, if he cared that much about Justine, he wouldn't need to be reminded. This is obviously for us as audience so that we can be introduced to Justine. So much like the satchel of books that the creature just happens to find and is able to teach itself language, I think there are some places that stretch disbelief in this particular novel. But again, considering the fact that this novel's never been out of print, and considering the fact of Mary Shelley's very tender age when she wrote this, she was still in her teens, I think we can excuse some of those perhaps lapses in the writing. But at any rate, Justine, and of course we see the element of justice within her name, Justine, and the root of that, we find out has been framed basically by the creature for the killing of William, which happens to be Victor's younger brother. The creature at this particular point, we learn his story soon after that. The creature runs off after its creation in the lab when Victor rejects it, and it basically has to fend for itself, and eventually it comes across what it thinks could be a friend or a compatriot, a child, someone who would have some sympathy and empathy for it. And instead it's William, who is Victor's brother, who basically insults the creature and says that his family, the Frankensteins, will come after the creature. And this is when the creature realizes that he can enact revenge on its creator for having abandoned it. And then at that particular point, Justine, who was out searching for for William, basically is asleep, and then the creature is able to plant some evidence on her, and happens to be a small miniature photo of Frankenstein's mother, and then that is the consequence of what the creature has been basically educated in. Not just language and in the majesty of humanity and nature, but also in the depravity of humanity and the baseness and the evil. It always reminds me a little bit of The Tempest, if any of you have ever read that, by William Shakespeare, thought to be Shakespeare's last play. There's a character named Caliban, who happens to be a native element of an island in which a European is shipwrecked on. And then this European basically takes advantage of Caliban. Caliban tries to offer it friendship and show it the magic that is evident in the isle, that exists in the island. And Prospero takes advantage of all of that and then basically imprisons Caliban. And what Caliban says is that, you taught me language as a European, and my profit on it is that I learned how to curse. And it's oftentimes seen as a story that is a commentary on colonialism and the treatment of Native Indigenous population, the mistreatment of Native Indigenous population by conquering European. And again, there are parallels with the creature in that it hasn't necessarily been born to exact revenge, but it's learned to exact revenge through its rejection from humanity. But what I also find quite interesting about Justine in chapter 8 is that she confesses to being guilty even though she's innocent. She says, I confessed a lie, and I confess that I might obtain absolution. And if you remember when we were talking about the cult of true womanhood and talking about the importance of piety for female, Justine is so frightened by religious authorities and the possibility of hellfire that she would rather confess to a lie than be excommunicated from the church, to go to show the power of the church during this particular time. And then when we go on to chapter 9, we find out a little bit about the creature itself and the reality that the creature is not monstrous, and certainly it isn't born with monstrous intent. And at least for me, the passage on page 83 of my text is when Justine says, I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution, but now that falsehood lies heavier in my heart than all other sins. The God of heaven, forgive me. Ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me. He threatened and menaced until I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. He threatened excommunication and hellfire in my last moments if I continued. And that gives us a little bit, again, a sense of the power of the church. That was in chapter 8. So then in chapter 9, we begin to find out a little bit more about the creature. And I'm very careful to call it the creature and not the monster, even though Hollywood has basically trained us to call it the monster, because he's not monstrous. He talks about how basically he is going to need to teach itself to survive because it's been completely abandoned. And it teaches itself not only through observation, but through trial and error, and talking a little bit about the beauty and also the pain associated with things such as fire. It does appreciate beauty in the natural world, and that's supposed to be evidence of its goodness, especially if we think of nature as female, and keep this in mind when we read a text like Jane Eyre. So that's a little hint of what's to come up. And engages in benevolent activities. True, because when it's beginning to watch the De Lacy family, it realizes that there are actions that it's taking that's hurting the family, such as taking their food stock, so it stops, and that there are actions that it can engage in that can assist the family, such as shoveling the snow, which it does, and collecting firewood. And at this point, the creature before we get the creature story, the creature and Victor have a confrontation with one another. And on page 95, this is where the creature says to Victor, I expected this reception, because basically Victor is calling it a devil. How dare you approach me? All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, whom I am miserable beyond all living things? Again, this is an incredibly articulate creature. Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, that creature to whom art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. You propose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends. And he's quite honest here, because that's exactly what happens. And the creature continues that says, life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me, and I will defend it. Remember that thou hast made me more powerful than thyself. My height is superior to thine, my joints more supple, but I will not be tempted to set myself in opposition to thee. I am thy creature, and I will be even mild and docile to my natural lord and king, if thou wilt also perform thy part, the part which thou owest me. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, in which I am alone and am excluded. I am benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. All of this is in chapter 10. And then he talks about, let's basically reason with one another and let me explain to you my situation. Will no entreaties cause thee to turn a favorable eye upon thy creature, who implores thy goodness and compassion? Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity. But am I not alone, miserably alone? You, my creator, abhor me. What hope can I gather from your fellow creatures who owe me nothing? They spurn and hate me. The desert mountains and dreary glaciers are my refuge. I've wandered here many days. The caves of ice, which I only do not fear, are a dwelling to me, and the only one which man does not grudge. These bleak skies I hail, for they are kinder to me than your fellow beings. If the multitude of mankind knew of my existence, they would do as you do and arm themselves for my destruction. Shall I not then hate them who abhor me? Shall I keep no terms with my enemies? Yet it is in your power to help me and deliver them from an evil which it only remains for you to make so great, that not only you and your family, but thousands of others shall be swallowed up the whirlwinds of its rage. Let your compassion be moved, and do not disdain me. Listen to my tale. And this, of course, is when we get the story of the creature's birth and how it awoke and it experienced in chapter 11 such pleasure with the natural world, and how it ultimately was able to teach itself language, able to use reason, and compares itself, after it learns language, to both Adam and Satan from Paradise Lost. Adam being the first human created by God, and that Adam needed a mate, and that's the whole point of the creature's tale, is that he wants a mate, and so that he's not alone. And he also compares himself to Satan, another creature from God who basically was rejected and thrown into the pits of hell. So as we continue on, we find out about that blind old man, the DeLacy story, and his exiled family. It's a rather long and convoluted tale, but it does involve the character of Safie, who is a particularly interesting character, just because of her background. And this is in chapter 14. By the way, in chapter 13, the creature asks, was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base? And the answer, sadly, is yes. So in chapter 14 is what we find out about Safie, whose father was a Turkish merchant. And Safie's mother, a Christian Arab, basically taught Safie, and this is a quote, to aspire to the higher powers of intellect and independence of spirit forbidden to the female followers of Muhammad. So even though we were talking about in the Cult of True Womanhood about how religion oftentimes served to repress and suppress female, Christianity did so less than perhaps other religions. At least that would be the commentary that Shelley is giving us within this particular text. Again, Shelley being very Christian-centric as well as very Eurocentric. Safie's mother, this is in chapter 14, loathed the idea, Safie's father on chapter 14, loathed the idea that his daughter should be united to a Christian. So the idea here is that there's been some injustice that's been done to the father, and Felix from the DeLacy family tries to protect the father, and the father is only able to offer his daughter basically as a reward and some monies, and Felix has fallen in love with the daughter, so that if he can somehow find a way to ensure the father's release from his captors, then he will be rewarded handsomely, or so he thinks. And the reality is that the father is only using his daughter as a ploy in order to be able to gain freedom. He has no intent to allow his daughter to be with a Christian, And then at one point, it's discovered that Felix has been trying to help him, and that results in the imprisonment of Felix's family and the loss of all of their wealth. And Safie, her response is that she is going to run away and going to pursue the DeLacy family, who, after they've been released, they basically have to go into exile and are living in poverty. And she will find them, and that's exactly what she does. Even though she doesn't know the language, even though she's a woman, even though she doesn't have any sense of autonomy or independence, at least based on the society in which she's lived in. So basically, this is at the very ending of chapter 14, where the DeLacy family found some asylum in a cottage in Germany, and Felix soon learned that the treacherous Turk, for whom he and his family endured such unheard of oppression, on discovering that his deliverer was thus reduced to poverty and ruin, became a traitor to good feeling and honor, quitted Italy with his daughter, insultingly sending Felix a pittance of money to aid him, and with the promise of in some plan to help with future maintenance, but it was a lie. And the idea was that the merchant commanded his daughter to think no more of her lover, but to prepare to return to her native country. And basically, her response is that she was going to run away from home. Taking with her some jewels that belonged to her and a sum of money, she quitted Italy with an attendant, but someone who understood the common language of Turkey, and departed for Germany. And eventually her attendant died and she was left on her own, but this strong woman, one way or another, is able to find herself with Felix. So that sense of independence and autonomy perhaps is somewhat comparable to Mary Shelley herself, if you know anything about her personal life, that it was rather scandalous in terms of her relationship with Percy Shelley, and that he was married at the time that they were together, so they were involved in an affair. And again, that would have been something that would have raised quite a few eyebrows. Keep that in mind when we read something like The Awakening at the ending of the semester. But Shelley's life was not a piece of fiction. Shelley's life was a piece of reality, about a woman who's able to defy societal convention in order to seek self-fulfillment. And I think we can see some of that with Safie as well. Granted, she's not a large character in the drama, in the novel, and we know that this is a very male-centric novel, and I argue that's one of the morals or lessons within the novel, that a world that excludes female or deprives female of voice and independence is a world of despair and destruction, which is the story of Frankenstein. So we find out that the creature, through the discovery of some papers in the pocket of the dress that he had taken from Victor's laboratory, in other words, again through letters, is able to find out the story of his creation, and that he realized that the only option he had left, now that the DeLacy family has rejected him, is to basically find Victor and to ask for a mate. You remember that part of the reason why the creature was going to approach the DeLacy family is because the patriarch was blind, so he would not be able to see the creature's appearance. And it seemed that the creature was going to be able to reason with the patriarch as the other family members were gone, but then the other family members returned, saw the creature's, quote, hideous, unquote, appearance, and then the result was that basically the family fled and the creature was left on its own. So, realizing in chapter 16, the creature says that on only you, he's talking about Victor, had I any claim for pity and redress. And then Victor says in chapter 19, I felt as if I had created or committed some great crime. I was guiltless, but I had indeed drawn down a horrible curse upon my head. That's not true. We know that he is quite guilty. And basically the creature is demanding a mate, which at this point Victor is willing to do with some hesitancy, but then Victor basically talks himself out of it with one rationalization and excuse after another. It could be that the mate and the creature would create havoc on society. It could be that the mate would reject the creature. It could be that the mate would ultimately give birth to a race of monstrosities. Though I always just wondered if Victor has the ability to create life from death, how could he not have the ability to make sure that the mate isn't able to procreate? And again, there are some places in the text where we have to suspend a little bit of disbelief. And the creature, upon realizing that Victor is going to destroy all of his work with working on the mate, it says in chapter 20, I shall be with you in your wedding night. Now think about this. Victor is so self-centered and arrogant. He assumes that the threat is against him personally rather than against his family and friends. And of course, the best way to enact revenge against somebody is to hurt the people that they love. But again, Victor doesn't have enough foresight to be able to see that. So it's not too surprising when the creature murders Elizabeth and then ultimately murders Clerval. And Clerval is a very interesting relationship with Victor. There's been a lot said about this very close male relationship, which was something that was not that uncommon during the Romantic period. In fact, some have said that the relationship that Victor has with Clerval is much more intimate than the relationship that he has with Elizabeth. That said, we really can't read any kind of sexual connotations into this particular text, because most of the text that we're given is less about the intimacy of relationship, and it's more about the desire to control and oppress and repress, and also the ability to reject. But that said, if you wanted to also think about the creature and his request, remember that, or demand, the creature is demanding a mate, which we can certainly empathize with because the creature doesn't want to be alone. And again, you can think about the story of Adam and Eve. But is not the creature engaging in the same sort of arrogance and hubris that Victor is about the demand or request to create life purely for its own benefit? And the life it wants is a female life. The assumption is that he will in one way or another control or manipulate this particular life. So there's some interesting questions about the creature's request, demand for mate. That's going to be today's attendance question, is what are your thoughts about that particular request? Should Victor have created a female for the creature? Why or why not? Again, no real right or wrong answer. That's something that you can kind of debate. But at any rate, after all of this, and we finally return to Walton. At this point, there's been all kinds of devastation in Victor's life. Not only has he lost Clerval, not only has he lost Elizabeth, not only has he lost his father out of heartbreak, now he's alone and he's basically intent on revenge. And this is where, in chapter 24, Victor talks a little bit to Walton's mutinous crew. And this is where I find that Victor is perhaps at his most unattractive, because up until this point, certainly he's talked about that he's made errors in the past, but that his goal, at least from what we were told in the beginning of the book, was to try to convince Walton not to engage in those particular errors. But that's not what we're going to get in chapter 24 when Victor talks to Walton's mutinous crew. And basically, he tells them, be men, or be more than men. Be steady to your purposes and firm as a rock. So basically, he's telling them not to retreat. And if they don't retreat, they're going to continue along the same path that Victor has continued along, with arrogance and hubris. And the consequences of that won't be good. We also learn from the creature at the ending, or at least we believe we hear from the creature. Again, this is the creature telling Walton, who's telling us, impotent envy and bitter indignation filled me with an insatiable thirst for vengeance. I was the slave, not the master, of an impulse which I detested, yet could not disobey. Of course, we could say, well, this must be proof that the creature exists because Walton has seen it, though, of course, Walton is in such a poor state, physically and emotionally. If he has created Victor, he can certainly create the creature. And even if he didn't create Victor, certainly at this point, he could have created the creature. Chapter 24, the creature says that now that Victor is gone, and dead, I shall collect my funeral pile and consume to ashes this miserable friend. So, unlike what we get in Hollywood, where the creature is destroyed by an outside force, what we get is a creature at the end who feels a certain level of remorse and decides to commit suicide because there really is no reason for it to live now that its creator, its enemy, but also its father, is gone and has perished. So, and think about how the extremes play such a role in this particular text. Something like fire and ice, and they are both the extremes, rather than finding something in the middle that's a bit more temperate. And when passions go to one extreme or another, these are the consequences of them. So I spent a little bit more time than I wanted to talking about Frankenstein, but that's okay because I wanted you to get at least a general sense of the book. And you'll notice that I have paper number 1, suggested paper topics and syllabus and other documents folder. Let me start off next class by talking about the suggested topics in paper number 1. And also I will talk a little bit about structuring papers and some of the ways that you could go about writing. Because I wanted to at least prepare you for Persuasion, which is our next text, and I can warn you right now that that probably is going to be the slowest read for you. Even though Jane Eyre is the longest book, it probably moves much faster than Persuasion, and that's done very deliberately. As I had indicated before, that definitely Frankenstein and Frankenstein's society is a society of privilege and a fair amount of wealth, but we haven't really seen a society of nobility, and this is exactly what we're going to see in Persuasion. And a kind of privilege and wealth that results in a lot of leisure time and a lot of difficulties in how to fill that particular leisure time. These are not particularly attractive characters. We're not supposed to like these characters. Anne Elliot, the female daughter, is the narrator, and we're supposed to empathize with her. She is a much more grounded and realistic person than her family. I can tell you right now that this text has a large number of characters. Many of them have very similar names, which was very common during the time of nobility and landed gentry, so that it's very easy to confuse them. And what I suggest is that you keep a list of the major characters. And you can see in the notes below that I've done just that for you, though you might want to keep your own list. I've divided it up into major male characters and major female characters, though there are lots of different ways you could divide up your list, whether it be through family or whether it be through marriage. Sir Walter Elliot is the father and the widower. The major question is, will he remarry? This entire book, Persuasion, is really about love relationships that were oftentimes embarked on for social furtherance or economic furtherance, not necessarily for romantic reasons. Charles Musgrove is married to Sir Walter's youngest daughter, Mary. He once proposed to Anne, the narrator, and she rejected him, so there's a little bit of tension there. And the idea that the youngest daughter is married, but the other two daughters, Anne and the older sister, Elizabeth, aren't married, also raising a good number of eyebrows, especially in terms of the expectations of female in this time period. Frederick Wentworth, who was formerly Anne's suitor, and he's also the brother to Mrs. Croft, and that's a character that we will be introduced to later in the novel, who ends up basically renting the family home, Kellynch Hall, because they've come across some financial difficulties, the Elliot family, so they need to rent out their residence. And the main question for Frederick Wentworth, because he's still single and he's quite eligible, is who will he court and marry? And the question is not will he marry, it's when will he marry and who will he marry? He went forth and got his fortune. He went and found his worth, hence his name, Frederick Wentworth. We're also introduced to William Elliot, Esquire, meaning an attorney. He's the cousin in the Elliot family, and he's the heir presumptive. Because there are no, there is no male child. There was a male child for Sir Walter Elliot that died. We're introduced to that idea at the beginning of the book. So now Sir Walter only has females. So the idea is that where will the inheritance go to? And probably it'll go to William Elliot. And while he is a lawyer, so that is something to that is something that brings some status. He certainly doesn't have the status of landed gentry. Admiral Croft is the one who rents Kilnich Hall from Sir Walter. He's married, and that he's married to Mrs. Croft, who again is the sister of Frederick Wentworth. Captain Harville ends up being Frederick Wentworth's friend that we are introduced to in the second part of Persuasion. Captain Benwick is Captain Harville's friend, and we get a story about his fiancee died, and now he's single, and the question is, how will he pick up the pieces, and who will he marry? Will he court again? And Charles Hayter, which happens to be a Musgrove family cousin, is single, and he's courting one of the Musgrove children. That happens to be Henrietta. Remember, that's the youngest daughter Mary's family, her married family. Not at all unusual for cousins to be dating so that they could keep the family status and the family income within the family. The female characters, so unlike what we saw with Frankenstein, we've got some central female characters here. Certainly Anne Elliot, Sir Walter's middle daughter, who is single. And who would ever want to court Anne? Throughout the novel, we're told that she's getting older. She's on the cusp of 30, and she's lost her bloom, supposedly, which means that she doesn't have her youthful beauty anymore. That would be so important for a female. Elizabeth Elliot is Sir Walter's oldest daughter. She's also single. People don't seem to much be worried about that because she basically has taken over as Sir Walter Elliot's caretaker now that Sir Walter Elliot is a widow. And we talked about in the story of an hour about how Mrs. Mallard became a widow, and that was oftentimes how female found freedom. And it was much less usual for a woman to remarry if she had lost her male spouse. That wasn't the case if it was the other way around. A male who had lost his female spouse would likely remarry. And there are lots of probably sociological and economic reasons for that, but I'm certain that part of it has to do with the idea that female had a certain level of autonomy in widowhood that she wouldn't necessarily want to relinquish. The idea with Elizabeth Elliot is that she's sort of taken over the role of the matriarch of the family, and that eventually she'll marry and she'll be just fine. And Sir Walter's quite fine with it because his older daughter is basically very similar to him, and she's taken on some of the caretaking roles. We have Mary Musgrove, Sir Walter's youngest daughter. She is indeed married. We have Lady Russell, who is a family friend and mother figure to Anne. Lady Russell is a widow and has not remarried and is not courting. Again, you can think about Mrs. Mallard if you were. Mrs. Musgrove is Charles Musgrove's mother, who happens to be married. Louisa Musgrove is the daughter of the Musgroves, or Charles Musgrove's sister. She's single. So, in other words, she's eligible. So she is going to be somebody who will be courted by Wentworth. Henrietta Musgrove is another single daughter of the Musgroves, sister to Charles, and she's being courted by her cousin, Charles Hayter. Mrs. Clay, notice she isn't given a title such as Lady for Lady Russell. Mrs. Clay is Elizabeth's friend and daughter, and she's Elizabeth's friend and daughter to Mr. Shepherd, who happens to be the family attorney, and she also is a widow. Will Sir Walter court her? She doesn't have status and she doesn't have money in widowhood. So there's questions as to why she's hanging on to this family even though she doesn't have status. Mrs. Smith is in a similar situation. She also is a widow. She's Anne's friend, also not courting, but she isn't given the status of a Mrs. Clay. We'll talk about some of the reasons why as the novel progresses. And a Mrs. Croft, who's married to Admiral Croft, and who also is the sister to Frederick Wentworth, and they rent out Kilnich Hall, and they are married, the Crofts. With a couple of minor characters that we're introduced to, the Viscountess Dalrymple, so she's superior in social status to the Elliot family, and that'll be important as the novel progresses. And as I had referenced earlier, Mr. Shepherd is the family attorney. So I know this is quite a mouthful and quite a list of characters. So I wanted to lay these out right at the beginning, and I suggest that you continue to refer to these. For today's attendance question, which would be due Friday on the 11th at 9 a.m., And if you need an extension, just let me know. Do you believe Victor should have created a female for the creature? Why or why not? What I'm going to do next class is to begin with talking about paper number 1. And then what I will do is I will move into beginning conversations about persuasion. So I hope you're all doing well and also staying cool. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.